The soft chime of Rosewood's most exclusive restaurant was supposed to announce another ordinary evening for Maya, a nursing student working double shifts to survive. But when Victoria Blackwood, the steel magnate worth $2.3 billion, walked through those doors, her piercing gaze locked onto something that would shatter two lives forever. The emerald necklace around Maya's neck, a simple thrift store find, was about to unleash a secret buried 15 years ago in a Swiss mountainside grave. What happened next would prove that some truths refuse to stay dead, no matter how deep you bury them. Maya Chen's hands trembled as she balanced the crystal wine glasses on her silver tray, the emerald necklace catching the restaurant's warm light with each careful step. At 23, she had mastered the art of invisibility, slipping between tables of Manhattan's elite while they discussed million-dollar deals over appetizers that cost more than her monthly rent. Her nursing textbooks waited in her locker, highlighted and dog-eared, a constant reminder of the future she was fighting to build one double shift at a time. The vintage necklace around her throat was her only indulgence, a $3 thrift store find that somehow made her feel less like a ghost in this world of designer gowns and platinum watches. She had no idea that in the next 60 seconds, this simple piece of jewelry would destroy everything she thought she knew about her life. The soft murmur of dinner conversation would soon be replaced by a silence so thick it felt like drowning. Victoria Blackwood didn't simply enter Rosewood, she conquered it. The steel magnate's presence shifted the very atmosphere of the restaurant, conversations dropping to reverent whispers as heads turned to catch a glimpse of the woman whose business empire stretched across 3 continents. Her Hermes coat, worth more than most people's cars, draped perfectly over her 72-year-old frame, while her ice-blue eyes surveyed the room with the calculating gaze of a predator. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had never been told no, her entourage of assistants and bodyguards trailing behind like satellites orbiting a deadly star. Maya had served powerful people before, but Victoria Blackwood was different. She radiated the kind of wealth that could end careers with a phone call, destroy lives with a whispered word. The air itself seemed to bend around her, heavy with the weight of $2 billion and the ruthless intelligence that had earned every penny. As her gaze swept the dining room, Maya felt an inexplicable chill, as if death itself had just walked through the door. The moment Victoria's eyes locked onto Maya's necklace, the world shifted on its axis. Time seemed to freeze as the billionaire's face transformed from cool indifference to raw, devastating shock, her perfect composure cracking like glass under pressure. The emerald pendant, so small, so insignificant, suddenly felt like a weight around Maya's throat, drawing the attention of every person in the room with magnetic force. Victoria's manicured hand flew to her chest, her breathing becoming shallow and ragged, as if she'd seen a ghost rise from the grave. The restaurant's gentle ambiance shattered as conversations died mid-sentence, forks suspended halfway to mouths, waitstaff frozen in place like mannequins. Maya's pulse thundered in her ears as she watched the most powerful woman in the room stagger backward, her face draining of color, until she looked like a porcelain doll about to shatter. Something was terribly, impossibly wrong, and Maya was standing at the center of a storm she didn't understand. That necklace! Victoria's voice cut through the silence like a blade, trembling with an emotion so raw it made grown men flinch. That necklace died with my daughter 15 years ago. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, each syllable loaded with grief so profound it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Maya's hand instinctively flew to her throat, fingers closing around the cool emerald that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat, while every eye in the restaurant turned to stare at her with a mixture of horror and fascination. The accusation was impossible, insane, yet the devastation in Victoria Blackwood's voice suggested a truth so dark it could destroy them both. As whispers began to ripple through the crowd and phones emerged to capture the unfolding drama, Maya realized that her quiet, invisible life was about to explode into a nightmare she never could have imagined. The thrift store necklace that had once made her feel special now felt like a noose tightening around her neck, binding her to secrets she'd never known existed. Victoria Blackwood's voice trembled with barely contained fury as she began to describe the necklace in meticulous detail, each word falling like a hammer blow on Maya's crumbling sense of reality. Hand-forged emerald centerpiece, surrounded by 12 micro-diamonds in a Celtic knot pattern, set in white gold with a custom safety clasp designed by Cartier's master jeweler in 1987. The billionaire's photographic memory painted a portrait so precise it made Maya's blood turn to ice because every detail was horrifyingly accurate down to the tiny scratch on the back left prong that Maya had always assumed was a manufacturing flaw. The restaurant patrons leaned forward, their expensive dinners forgotten as they witnessed what appeared to be either an impossible coincidence or evidence of the most brazen grave robbery in New York history. Maya's legs threatened to give out beneath her as the weight of the accusations settled over her like a burial shroud, while her mind raced to find any logical explanation for how a billionaire could describe her thrift store treasure with surgical precision. The emerald that had once felt warm against her skin now seemed to burn like a brand, marking her as either the unluckiest person alive or something far more sinister. She could feel the walls closing in as Victoria's security team moved closer, their hands resting meaningfully on concealed weapons. The backstory tumbled from Maya's lips in desperate, broken fragments as she tried to explain the inexplicable. How, 3 years ago, wandering through a cluttered thrift shop in Queens, her eyes had been drawn to this necklace as if by some invisible force. She remembered the moment with crystalline clarity, the way the emerald had seemed to pulse with its own inner light beneath the flickering fluorescent bulbs, how her fingers had trembled as she lifted it from the dusty jewelry case, the strange sense of coming home that had washed over her when she first clasped it around her neck. The elderly shop owner had sold it to her for $3, claiming it had been donated months earlier by someone cleaning out a deceased relative's belongings, but no other details existed. No name, no history, just an orphaned piece of jewelry seeking a new owner. Maya had worn it every day since, through final exams and double shifts, through heartbreak and small victories, until it had become as much a part of her as her own pulse. Now, as Victoria's accusations hung in the air like poison gas, that same necklace felt like evidence in a crime she didn't remember committing, its familiar weight transformed into something alien and terrifying. The coincidence was so astronomical that even Maya found herself questioning her own innocence, wondering if trauma could make someone forget something as horrific as grave robbing. Victoria's security chief, a man built like a granite monument with eyes like winter steel, stepped forward and whispered something in his employer's ear that made her face shift from rage to something approaching panic. Maya watched in growing terror as the billionaire's composure, legendary in boardrooms and feared by competitors, began to crack like ice in a spring thaw, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. The head of security was already making calls, his voice a low growl as he spoke to someone about securing the scene and potential evidence tampering, words that made Maya's nursing school dreams feel like they were slipping through her fingers like sand. Other diners had their phones out now, recording what was rapidly becoming the most explosive confrontation to hit Manhattan's social scene in decades, while Maya stood trapped in the center of it all like an animal caught in headlights. She could see her reflection in the restaurant's mirrors, a small, terrified girl in a cheap uniform surrounded by wealth and power that could crush her without a second thought. The manager, Mr. Hendricks, appeared at her elbow like a nervous ghost, his face pale as he calculated the cost of having Victoria Blackwood make a scene in his establishment versus the potential lawsuit of wrongfully terminating an employee. "Remove that necklace immediately, Mr." Hendricks commanded, his voice shaking with the kind of fear that comes from watching your career hang in the balance. Maya's hands moved to her throat protectively, her fingers closing around the emerald like a drowning person clinging to driftwood. Because removing the necklace felt like losing the last piece of herself she truly owned. Victoria stepped closer, her presence filling Maya's vision like an approaching storm cloud, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the quiet menace of someone accustomed to having her commands obeyed without question. "That necklace was placed around my daughter Sarah's neck before her coffin was sealed and lowered into the ground at Woodlawn Cemetery 15 years ago," she whispered, each word a dagger thrust. "I watched them close the casket myself, watched the dirt cover her grave, and I have visited that headstone every month since to make sure it remains undisturbed." The implication hung in the air like a death sentence. Either Maya was a grave robber, or something impossible was happening that defied every law of logic and decency. As the security team closed in and the restaurant held its collective breath, Maya realized that her life as she knew it was over, replaced by a nightmare where the dead could apparently rise from their graves to reclaim their jewelry. The only question remaining was whether she would survive long enough to discover the truth behind this impossible accusation. The silence that followed Victoria's accusation was broken only by the soft clink of expensive silverware being carefully set down as the entire restaurant held its collective breath, waiting for Maya's response to what seemed like an impossible claim. Maya's voice came out as barely a whisper, her vocal cords constricted by fear and confusion as she stammered, "Mom, I bought this necklace at a thrift store 3 years ago. I have the receipt at home, I can prove it." But even as the words left her lips, she could see they carried no weight against the granite certainty in Victoria Blackwood's eyes, a certainty forged by 15 years of grief and a mother's intimate knowledge of her daughter's most precious possession. The billionaire's laugh was sharp and bitter, cutting through the air like broken glass, as she shook her head with the kind of pity reserved for pathological liars caught in an obvious deception. Victoria stepped closer, her presence suffocating as she invaded Maya's personal space, and when she spoke, her voice carried the cold finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. "Thrift stores don't sell artifacts stolen from the dead, young woman," she hissed, her breath hot against Maya's face. "They sell donated clothing and forgotten trinkets, not custom jewelry that cost more than your annual salary and was buried 6 feet underground in a sealed casket." Maya felt the walls of her carefully constructed life beginning to crumble as the weight of the accusation pressed down on her like a physical force, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to exist. The flashback hit Victoria like a physical blow, 15 years of carefully constructed emotional barriers crashing down as she was transported back to the worst day of her life, standing beside an open grave in the rain, watching her only daughter's casket being lowered into the earth while her heart died a little more with each shovelful of dirt. Sarah had been 25, brilliant, rebellious, and utterly determined to forge her own path in the world, despite her mother's attempts to guide her toward a more suitable life befitting a Blackwood heir. The climbing expedition to Switzerland had been Sarah's latest act of defiance, her way of proving she didn't need the family fortune or connections to find meaning and adventure in life. And Victoria had spent their last conversation trying to talk her out of what she saw as a dangerous and pointless endeavor. The phone call from the Swiss authorities had shattered Victoria's world. An avalanche, they said. Sarah's body recovered 3 days later, the injuries too severe for an open casket funeral, leaving Victoria with nothing but memories and the knowledge that their final words had been spoken in anger. She had personally selected every detail of Sarah's burial outfit, from the vintage Chanel dress to the pearl earrings that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother, but the necklace, the emerald Celtic knot that Sarah had treasured above all her other jewelry, had been the final touch, Victoria's way of ensuring her daughter would carry something beautiful into whatever came after death. Now seeing that same necklace around a stranger's throat felt like watching her daughter's grave being desecrated in real time, a violation so profound it made her question her own sanity. Maya's protest came out as a desperate sob, her voice cracking under the weight of an accusation that threatened to destroy not just her reputation, but her entire sense of self as a decent human being. "I would never desecrate someone's grave," she cried, tears streaming down her face as she clutched the necklace like a lifeline. "I'm studying to be a nurse. I dedicate my life to helping people, to healing, to making things better, not destroying them." Her words rang with such genuine anguish that even some of the restaurant's patrons began to shift uncomfortably, their initial fascination with the drama giving way to something approaching sympathy for the young woman who seemed to be drowning in circumstances beyond her control. Maya's hands shook as she tried to explain what couldn't be explained, how she had felt drawn to the necklace the moment she saw it, how wearing it made her feel connected to something larger than herself, how the very idea of stealing from the dead made her physically ill. She thought of all the elderly patients she had cared for during her clinical rotations, the dignity she had tried to preserve for them even in their final moments, the sacred trust between healer and patient that formed the foundation of everything she believed about herself. The accusation wasn't just threatening her freedom, it was attacking the core of who she was as a person, suggesting that beneath her compassionate exterior lurked the soul of a monster capable of the most heinous sacrilege. As Victoria's security team moved closer and the crowd of onlookers grew larger, Maya felt herself falling into an abyss where truth and lies became indistinguishable, where innocence offered no protection against the brutal machinery of wealth and power. Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout could have achieved, her words carefully chosen to inflict maximum psychological damage on the young woman who dared to wear her daughter's grave jewelry. 15 years ago, I stood in the rain at Woodlawn Cemetery and watched them seal my daughter's casket," she said, each word precisely enunciated like a prayer or a curse. "I personally placed that necklace around Sarah's neck, smoothed her hair one final time, and kissed her forehead before they closed the lid forever." The raw grief in her voice was unmistakable, a mother's pain so profound it seemed to fill the entire restaurant with its weight, making everyone present feel like unwilling witnesses to the most private kind of suffering. Victoria's eyes never left Maya's face as she continued, "That necklace has been 6 feet underground for 15 years, surrounded by my daughter's bones in a casket that cost $50,000 and was supposed to keep her at peace for eternity." The implication was clear and terrifying. Either Maya was a grave robber of the most despicable kind, or something impossible was happening that defied every law of nature and decency. As the security team prepared to escort Maya away and the police sirens could be heard in the distance, Victoria delivered her final blow with surgical precision. "The only way you could have that necklace is if you dug up my daughter's grave and stole it from her corpse, and I intend to see you prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law for desecrating the dead." Maya felt the last vestiges of her normal life slip away, as she realized the truth alone would not be enough to save her from a nightmare that seemed to have no logical explanation and no possible escape. The forensic expert arrived within the hour, a thin, precise woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, whose reputation for solving impossible cases had made her the go-to consultant for Manhattan's wealthiest families when they needed answers that the police couldn't provide. Her silver briefcase contained instruments that could detect DNA traces invisible to the naked eye, chemical compounds that hadn't existed when Sarah Blackwood was buried, and decades of experience in distinguishing between authentic artifacts and elaborate forgeries. Maya watched in terrified fascination as Dr. Vasquez photographed the necklace from every angle, her movements methodical and clinical, while Victoria stood nearby like a statue carved from grief and determination. The restaurant's private dining room had been converted into an impromptu laboratory, with curious staff members shooed away and the remaining patrons relocated to give the investigation the privacy it demanded. Maya's hands trembled as she reluctantly removed the necklace, feeling strangely naked without its familiar weight against her throat, while Dr. Vasquez sealed it in an evidence bag with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious relics. The whole scene felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold on a movie screen, except the consequences were devastatingly real, and there would be no director to yell, "Cut!" when things got too intense. 20 minutes later, Dr. Vasquez looked up from her microscope with an expression that made everyone in the room hold their breath, her professional composure cracked by whatever she had discovered in the necklace's molecular history. "This is highly unusual," she began, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to deliver shocking news without betraying personal emotion. "The necklace shows clear signs of having been buried. There are mineral deposits consistent with cemetery soil, tarnishing patterns that suggest prolonged underground exposure, and microscopic organic matter that could only come from prolonged contact with decomposing organic material." Victoria's face went white as the implications sank in, because this evidence seemed to confirm her worst fears about Maya being a grave robber. But Dr. Vasquez wasn't finished with her bombshell revelation. "However," she continued, adjusting her glasses as she peered at her notes, "the DNA traces I've extracted from the clasp mechanism don't match the cemetery records for Sarah Blackwood. In fact, they don't match any DNA profile in the national database." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of traffic outside and the soft hum of the restaurant's ventilation system as everyone tried to process information that seemed to defy all logical explanation. Maya felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion wash over her. She wasn't a grave robber, but the mystery had only deepened into something far more complex and terrifying. Maya's revelation came tumbling out in a rush of words and tears. 15 years of strange dreams and inexplicable feelings suddenly taking on new significance in light of the investigation's impossible findings. "I've been having these dreams since I started wearing the necklace," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the room's stunned silence. "Dreams about snow-covered mountains, about falling, about someone calling my name in a voice I almost recognize but can never quite place." She described nights when she would wake up with tears on her face and no memory of why she was crying. Mornings when she would find herself humming melodies she had never heard before. Moments of inexplicable sadness that would wash over her like waves whenever she looked at photographs of the Swiss Alps. The dreams were always fragments, flashes of images that felt more like memories than imagination, but they shared common elements. The sensation of cold mountain air, the sound of wind through pine trees, and always, the feeling that someone was waiting for her just beyond the edge of consciousness. Victoria listened to Maya's confession with growing unease because the details were too specific, too accurate to dismiss as coincidence or elaborate deception. How could a girl from Queens know that Sarah had died in the Swiss mountains unless she had some connection to events that had never been made public? Maya's hands shook as she continued. "Sometimes I wake up and I can still feel the cold, like I've been somewhere else entirely, and there's this overwhelming sense of loss, like I've forgotten something incredibly important." The room felt charged with an energy that none of them could name, as if the boundaries between the living and the dead were somehow becoming permeable. The arrival of Marcus Blackwood changed the entire dynamic of the investigation, his tall frame filling the doorway as he surveyed the scene with the sharp intelligence that had made him one of New York's most successful corporate lawyers. At 45, he possessed his mother's commanding presence, but tempered it with a warmth that Victoria had never managed to master, and Maya found herself hoping that he might be the voice of reason in a situation that had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. Marcus's eyes immediately went to the evidence bag containing the necklace, and Maya watched his face transform from professional curiosity to something approaching horror, his skin going pale as if he had seen a ghost. "Mother," he said, his voice strained with an emotion Maya couldn't identify, "we need to talk privately." But Victoria was having none of it, her maternal instincts and business acumen combining to form an immovable force of determination. "Whatever you have to say can be said in front of everyone," she declared, her voice brooking no argument. "This girl has desecrated your sister's grave, and I want answers." Marcus closed his eyes for a long moment, as if gathering strength for a revelation that would change everything, and when he opened them again, Maya saw something that made her blood run cold: recognition, guilt, and a terrible understanding that suggested the mystery was about to take an even darker turn. "Mother," he said quietly, his words falling like stones into still water, "there's something about Sarah's death that I never told you. Something I've kept secret for 15 years to protect her memory and your sanity." The admission hung in the air like a death sentence, promising revelations that would shatter what remained of Victoria's carefully constructed understanding of her daughter's final days. Marcus Blackwood's confession shattered the air like breaking glass, his voice heavy with 15 years of carefully guarded secrets as he began to unravel the official story of his sister's death that had defined their family's grief for over a decade. "Sarah wasn't alone on that mountain," he said, his words falling like hammer blows on Victoria's composure, each syllable carrying the weight of a truth that had been buried deeper than any grave. "She was with someone, a man she had been seeing in secret for over a year, someone she knew you would never approve of because he wasn't from our world." Victoria's face transformed from confusion to horror as the implications began to sink in, her perfectly controlled mask slipping to reveal the raw terror of a mother realizing she had never truly known her own daughter. Marcus continued relentlessly, his lawyer's training evident in the methodical way he laid out facts that had been hidden for 15 years. His name was David Chen, a mountain guide and rescue specialist who had been leading climbing expeditions in the Swiss Alps since he was 18 years old. The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow because she remembered Sarah mentioning a guide named David in her letters home. But she had dismissed him as just another hired hand, never imagining that her daughter could fall in love with someone so far beneath their social station. Maya listened in stunned silence, her mind racing to connect these new pieces of information to her own mysterious dreams of mountains and snow, while Dr. Vasquez took careful notes that would later prove crucial to solving the entire puzzle. The restaurant's private dining room felt like a confessional booth where decades of family secrets were finally being dragged into the light, regardless of how much pain the truth might cause. The story that emerged from Marcus's reluctant testimony painted a picture of young love, complicated by family expectations and social barriers that seemed insurmountable to everyone, except the two people who dared to cross them. Sarah had met David during a solo climbing trip to Switzerland the previous summer, drawn to his quiet competence and complete indifference to her family name or fortune. And what began as a professional relationship between guide and client had blossomed into something deeper and more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. Marcus revealed letters that Sarah had written but never sent, emails that had been deleted but recovered from old hard drives, phone records that showed hours of international calls made in secret during the months leading up to her final trip. "She was planning to tell you about him," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at his mother's stricken face. "She wanted to bring him home for Christmas, to introduce him properly, but she was terrified of your reaction." Victoria's hands shook as she processed this information because she could imagine exactly how she would have reacted to Sarah announcing her intention to marry a mountain guide with no family connections, no fortune, and no understanding of the responsibilities that came with being a Blackwood heir. The irony was devastating. In trying to protect her daughter from what she saw as an unsuitable match, Victoria had inadvertently driven Sarah to keep the most important relationship of her life completely hidden. Maya felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to this tale of forbidden love, because something about the name David Chen resonated in her mind like an echo from a half-remembered dream, though she couldn't understand why a stranger's name should feel so familiar. Marcus's voice broke as he revealed the final, devastating piece of the puzzle that had haunted him for 15 years and shaped every decision he had made since Sarah's death. The climbing accident wasn't an accident, he whispered, the words barely audible but carrying enough force to make everyone in the room lean forward in shock. Sarah called me the night before she died, crying, desperate. And she told me something that I've never been able to forget. She was pregnant. Victoria's gasp echoed through the room like a gunshot, her face draining of color as the full magnitude of what her son was telling her began to sink in, because the revelation meant that Sarah hadn't just died alone on that mountain. She had died carrying Victoria's grandchild. Marcus continued through his tears, his professional composure finally crumbling under the weight of secrets that had poisoned his soul for over a decade. She was 3 months along, terrified to tell you because she knew you would try to control the situation, maybe even force her to terminate the pregnancy or take the baby away from David. The confession tumbled out in a rush of guilt and pain. How Sarah had planned to disappear with David until after the baby was born, how she had been climbing routes that were well within her skill level when the avalanche hit, how the rescue teams had found evidence of a temporary camp that suggested they had been living on the mountain for several days before the tragedy struck. Victoria sat in stunned silence, her world reshaping itself around the knowledge that she had lost not just a daughter, but a grandchild, that her controlling nature had driven Sarah to such desperate measures that she had chosen exile over honesty. Maya felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to this story of love and loss, though she couldn't understand why Sarah's tragedy affected her so deeply, or why the mention of David Chen made her heart race with inexplicable recognition. The revelation that followed was even more devastating than anything that had come before, as Marcus finally found the courage to confess the secret that had been eating him alive for 15 years and had shaped every interaction with his mother since Sarah's death. The avalanche didn't kill them immediately, he said, his voice hollow with the weight of unbearable knowledge. David managed to get Sarah to an emergency shelter, one of those mountain rescue huts that are scattered throughout the Alps for situations exactly like this one. Victoria's hands flew to her mouth as she began to understand what her son was telling her. The implications so enormous that her mind struggled to process them, while Maya sat frozen in her chair, feeling as though she was listening to someone else's life story that somehow felt intimately familiar. Marcus continued relentlessly, knowing that stopping now would make the confession incomplete and therefore worthless. Sarah lived for 4 more days after the avalanche, conscious and aware, and in those 4 days she gave birth to a premature but healthy baby girl. The silence that followed was so complete that Maya could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, while Victoria began to hyperventilate as she realized that everything she thought she knew about her daughter's death had been a carefully constructed lie designed to protect her from a truth that Marcus had deemed too painful to share. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her notes with new understanding, pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to fall into place, while Maya felt the world spinning around her as fragments of her dreams suddenly took on new meaning. The cold mountain air, the sense of loss, the feeling that someone was calling her name in a voice she almost recognized. David found me online a week later, Marcus concluded, his voice barely above a whisper, and he told me that Sarah had died from internal bleeding shortly after the birth, but that the baby had survived, and he was going to make sure she found a good home where she would be safe from our family's influence forever. The search for David Chen consumed the next 72 hours like a fever, with Victoria's vast network of private investigators, former CIA operatives, and international contacts working around the clock to locate a man who had spent 15 years deliberately staying invisible. Maya found herself trapped in a surreal waiting game, staying at the Blackwood mansion while teams of experts combed through immigration records, employment databases, and property registries across 3 countries, looking for any trace of the mountain guide who held the key to her entire existence. The mansion felt like a museum dedicated to grief, with portraits of Sarah watching from every wall and an atmosphere so thick with unspoken sorrow that Maya could barely breathe, while Victoria moved through the halls like a ghost haunted by the possibility that her granddaughter had been alive all along. Marcus coordinated the search with military precision, his legal mind organizing information flows and evidence chains with the kind of methodical intensity that had made him one of Manhattan's most feared attorneys. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a climbing equipment manufacturer in Colorado who remembered processing insurance claims for a guide named David Chen, who had suffered severe frostbite damage during a rescue operation in Switzerland 15 years earlier. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs as she listened to Marcus relay the information over speakerphone, because after days of dead ends and false leads, they finally had a current address for the man who might hold the answers to questions she hadn't even known to ask. Victoria stood rigid as carved marble beside the phone, her composure maintained through sheer force of will. But Maya could see the tremor in her hands that betrayed the emotional earthquake happening beneath her carefully controlled surface. David Chen answered the phone on the 3rd ring, his voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who had spent years living with secrets too heavy for one person to bear alone. The conversation that followed was surreal in its intensity, as Marcus carefully navigated the delicate process of explaining how they had found him, while David's initial panic gave way to resigned acceptance that this day had always been inevitable. "I've been waiting for this call for 15 years, David said, his words heavy with exhaustion that seemed to reach through the phone and fill the mansion's library with its weight. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time I saw a young woman who looked like Sarah, I wondered if this would be the day someone came looking for answers." Maya listened to his voice with growing recognition, something deep in her subconscious responding to tones and cadences that felt familiar, despite the fact that she was certain they had never spoken before. David's account of those final days on the mountain was devastating in its clinical precision. How he had managed to get Sarah to an emergency shelter after the avalanche, how they had used survival equipment and his medical training to create a makeshift delivery room in a hut designed for mountaineers caught in storms, how Sarah had fought for 4 days to bring their daughter into the world before internal bleeding claimed her life. Victoria wept openly as she listened to David describe her daughter's final moments, how Sarah had held the baby for precious minutes before her strength failed, how she had whispered the child's name with her last coherent breath, how David had wrapped the newborn in his own jacket and carried her down the mountain in sub-zero temperatures that should have killed them both. The image was so vivid and heartbreaking that Maya found herself crying for people she had never met, though something about David's voice made her feel as though she was listening to a story she had heard before, in dreams she couldn't quite remember. David's confession about what happened after Sarah's death revealed a level of sacrifice and protection that left everyone in the room speechless with its profound moral complexity. "Sarah made me promise that the baby would never be found by her family," he said, his voice breaking with 15 years of accumulated guilt and sorrow. She was terrified that Victoria would try to control the child's life, the same way she had tried to control hers, and she made me swear on her grave that I would find a way to keep her daughter safe from the Blackwood name and everything that came with it. Maya felt as though she was falling through space as she listened to David explain how he had carried a 3-day-old infant down a mountain in the middle of winter, using emergency heating packs and his own body warmth to keep her alive during a descent that should have been impossible for someone so small and fragile. He described the agonizing decision to give the baby to his sister Rachel, a social worker in Denver who had connections with private adoption networks that specialized in placing children with families who asked no questions about their origins. The baby had been healthy despite her premature birth and traumatic first days, but David had known that raising her himself would eventually lead the Blackwood investigators to her door. So he had made the hardest decision of his life and signed away his parental rights to protect her from a family he believed would destroy her spirit just as they had destroyed Sarah's. Maya's hands shook as she realized she was listening to her own origin story, the explanation for why she had grown up in foster care instead of in a mansion, why she had no memory of family or heritage, why she had always felt like a piece of a larger puzzle that she could never quite solve. David's voice carried the weight of a man who had spent 15 years wondering if he had made the right choice, and Maya found herself both grateful for his protection and devastated by the childhood she had lost as a result of his sacrifice. The final revelation hit like a physical blow, rendering everyone in the room speechless as David shared the detail that tied everything together in a knot of irony, so twisted it seemed crafted by a cruel universe. Before Sarah died, she took off her necklace, the emerald one she never removed, and pressed it into my hands, David said, his voice hollow with memory. She told me it was the only thing of value she could give her daughter, something to remember her by, even if the child never knew who she really was. Maya's fingers flew to her throat, touching the familiar weight of the necklace that suddenly felt like a message from beyond the grave, while Victoria's face transformed from grief to something approaching awe as she realized her daughter's final act had been one of maternal love rather than rebellion. David continued through tears that were 15 years overdue. I kept it for 3 years, carrying it everywhere, but I couldn't bear to look at it because it reminded me of everything I had lost. Sarah, the life we had planned, the child I would never know. His voice broke completely as he described placing the necklace in a donation box at a thrift store in Denver. Unable to throw it away, but no longer able to live with its presence in his life. Never imagining that someday it would find its way to the daughter he had sworn to protect. The cosmic irony was staggering. Maya had purchased her own mother's necklace from a thrift store, drawn to it by instincts she couldn't understand, wearing it every day without knowing it was the last gift Sarah had tried to give her before death claimed her life. Victoria stared at Maya with new understanding, seeing not just her granddaughter, but the living embodiment of Sarah's love. While Maya struggled to process the knowledge that the mysterious dreams and inexplicable feelings she had experienced while wearing the necklace were actually genetic memory, calling her back to a mother she had never known, but who had loved her enough to die, bringing her into the world. The truth was simultaneously beautiful and heartbreaking, a testament to the power of maternal love to transcend death itself and guide a lost child back to her origins through the simple weight of jewelry against her throat. The DNA testing facility looked more like a space laboratory than a medical office, its sterile white walls lined with equipment that hummed with quiet precision, while Maya sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, watching technicians prepare samples that would either confirm or destroy the most impossible story she had ever heard. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the geneticist Victoria had flown in from Boston, moved with the methodical efficiency of someone who had delivered life-changing news to thousands of families. her face professionally neutral as she explained the testing process that would compare Maya's genetic markers to samples from Sarah's personal effects that had been preserved in the Blackwood family vault for 15 years. The waiting room felt like purgatory, with Victoria pacing like a caged predator, while Marcus sat rigidly in his chair, his lawyer's mind probably calculating the legal implications of every possible outcome. Maya found herself studying her own hands, as if seeing them for the first time, wondering if they carried Sarah's artistic talents or David's mountain-climbing strength, while part of her mind screamed that this was all an elaborate mistake that would be exposed the moment the results came back negative. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, marking time in a space where past and future collided with the brutal finality of scientific truth. Dr. Martinez had warned them that the results would be conclusive. Either Maya was Sarah Blackwood's biological daughter, or she was an innocent girl caught up in the most tragic case of mistaken identity in recent memory. And there would be no middle ground, no room for doubt or wishful thinking. The psychological pressure of waiting for results that would redefine her entire existence proved almost unbearable for Maya, whose carefully constructed identity as an orphaned nursing student began to feel as fragile as tissue paper in a hurricane. She found herself oscillating between desperate hope and paralyzing terror, hope that she finally had answers to the questions that had haunted her entire life, and terror that those answers would come with responsibilities and expectations she was utterly unprepared to handle. Victoria watched her granddaughter with the intensity of a scientist observing a rare specimen, her maternal instincts warring with 15 years of grief and the growing realization that her controlling behavior had cost her not just a daughter, but precious years with a grandchild who had grown up believing herself unwanted and alone. The mansion felt different during those 48 hours of waiting, as if the very walls were holding their breath, while Maya explored rooms that might have been her mother's childhood sanctuaries and tried to imagine what her life might have been like if Sarah had lived to raise her in luxury instead of love. She discovered Sarah's art studio, preserved exactly as it had been on the day of her departure for Switzerland, canvases half-finished and paintbrushes still stiff with dried acrylics, and Maya found herself weeping for a woman she had never known, but whose genetic echo seemed to whisper through every brushstroke. Marcus tried to prepare her for both possible outcomes, explaining that a positive result would make her one of the wealthiest young women in America overnight, while a negative result would send her back to her life of double shifts and student loans, with nothing but the memory of a few surreal days when she had almost belonged somewhere. The waiting became a form of torture, each hour stretching like taffy as Maya's mind created elaborate fantasies about the family she might have and the life she might claim, while her practical nursing school training reminded her that hope could be more dangerous than despair. Victoria's transformation during those 2 days of waiting revealed depths of vulnerability that no one had seen since Sarah's funeral. Her legendary composure cracking to reveal a woman who had spent 15 years building walls around a heart that was desperate to love something again. She began sharing stories about Sarah that she had never told anyone. Tales of a rebellious little girl who painted murals on her bedroom walls and insisted on rescuing injured birds despite her mother's protests about germs and proper behavior. Maya listened to these stories with growing fascination, searching for echoes of herself in descriptions of a mother she might never have known, and finding disturbing parallels in Sarah's stubborn independence and artistic temperament that seemed to mirror her own personality in ways that felt too significant to be coincidental. Victoria's voice would break when she described Sarah's laugh, or the way she would challenge authority figures, even as a toddler. And Maya began to see glimpses of the woman Victoria might have been if grief and guilt hadn't calcified her heart into something resembling stone more than flesh. The billionaire's admission that she had driven Sarah away came in fragments, small confessions of control and manipulation that she had convinced herself were acts of love, but now recognized as the weapons that had destroyed her relationship with her only daughter. Maya found herself in the bizarre position of comforting the woman who might be her grandmother, offering tissues and gentle words, while Victoria wept for mistakes that had cost her 15 years of knowing the granddaughter she had unknowingly been mourning alongside her daughter. The role reversal was surreal. Maya, who had spent her life caring for others as a survival mechanism, now found herself nurturing the woman whose wealth and power could reshape her entire future, but whose emotional fragility made her seem more like a patient than a potential family member. Dr. Martinez called them back to the laboratory on a grey Thursday morning that felt heavy with the weight of impending revelation, her professional demeanor unable to completely mask the gravity of what she was about to reveal to three people whose lives would never be the same, regardless of what the test results showed. Maya's hands trembled as she sat between Victoria and Marcus in chairs that felt more like witness stands, while Dr. Martinez opened a manila folder with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that the papers inside contained the power to create or destroy a family. "The results are conclusive," she began, her voice carrying the authority of scientific certainty that left no room for doubt or denial. Maya Chen is the biological daughter of Sarah Blackwood, with a 99.97% probability match that exceeds the legal standard for paternity confirmation. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and a birth certificate rolled into one, while Maya felt the world tilt on its axis as her entire identity restructured itself around this new reality. Victoria's gasp was audible across the room, a sound of pure joy, mixed with devastating sorrow as she realized that her granddaughter had been alive and struggling alone, while she had been visiting an empty grave and mourning a bloodline she thought had ended with Sarah's death. Marcus reached across the space between the chairs and took Maya's hand, his grip steady and warm as she struggled to process the fact that she was no longer Maya Chen, orphaned nursing student, but Maya Blackwood, heir to a fortune she had never wanted, and a family legacy she didn't understand. Dr. Martinez continued with additional details about genetic markers and probability calculations, but Maya could barely hear her over the roaring in her ears as 23 years of questions finally received their devastating, life-changing answers. She had a family, she had a history, she had a biological connection to the earth that she had never experienced before, and the weight of that knowledge felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying as she realized that her life of invisibility and anonymity was about to end forever. The DNA results transformed the sterile laboratory into a courtroom where 15 years of lies, secrets, and carefully constructed truths were finally being judged by the unforgiving tribunal of genetic science. Maya stared at the official document that declared her Maya Blackwood, her hands shaking as she tried to reconcile this new identity with the girl who had served overpriced wine to strangers just a week earlier, while Victoria sat frozen in her chair as if movement might shatter the fragile miracle of having her granddaughter returned from the dead. Dr. Martinez continued explaining the technical details of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers, but her words faded into background noise as Maya struggled to understand that every assumption she had made about her origins had been spectacularly, devastatingly wrong. The necklace around her throat, returned to her after the testing was complete, now felt like a talisman, connecting her to a mother who had died bringing her into the world, and Maya found herself touching it compulsively as if it might provide some stability in a reality that seemed to be shifting beneath her feet like quicksand. Marcus cleared his throat and asked the practical questions that his legal training demanded. questions about inheritance law, estate planning, and the logistics of integrating a granddaughter who had been legally dead for 15 years into a financial empire worth billions of dollars. Victoria seemed incapable of speech, her eyes fixed on Maya's face as if she were memorizing every feature, cataloguing similarities to Sarah that she had been too shocked to notice during their first confrontation in the restaurant. The laboratory felt too small to contain the magnitude of what was happening. 3 people whose lives had just been permanently altered by information that would reshape not just their family, but their understanding of love, loss, and the cruel randomness of fate. The drive back to the Blackwood mansion passed in surreal silence, with Maya pressed against the window of the Mercedes, watching New York blur past, while her mind tried to process the fact that she was now one of the wealthiest young women in America, despite having overdraft fees on her checking account just days earlier. Victoria sat rigid in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at Maya, as if to confirm she was still there, still real, still the miraculous answer to 15 years of prayers she had been too proud to voice, even in her most desperate moments. The mansion looked different when they pulled up the circular driveway, no longer a museum to grief, but a family home where Maya's mother had grown up, where her footsteps had worn paths through hallways that Maya was now walking for the first time, but which felt somehow familiar in ways her rational mind couldn't explain. Marcus guided them to Sarah's preserved bedroom, a shrine to a daughter frozen in time at 25, and Maya felt overwhelmed by the intimate details of a life she had inherited but never lived. Concert tickets from bands she had never heard of, books with margins full of notes in handwriting that looked disturbingly similar to her own, photographs of Sarah with friends whose faces Maya studied for family resemblances she was now genetically entitled to claim. Victoria stood in the doorway watching Maya explore her mother's possessions, and for the first time since the restaurant confrontation, her face showed something approaching peace as she witnessed her granddaughter connecting with the daughter she had lost. The room felt like a time capsule, preserved with the desperate hope that Sarah might someday return to reclaim her belongings, and now Maya was doing exactly that, though neither the return nor the circumstances were anything Victoria could have imagined in her most fantastic dreams. David Chen's video call from Colorado provided the final pieces of a puzzle that had consumed Maya's entire existence for over a decade, his weathered face appearing on the laptop screen like a ghost from a past she was only beginning to understand. The mountain guide looked older than his 45 years, his hair prematurely grey and his eyes carrying the weight of secrets that had isolated him from normal human connection for 15 long years of guilt and self-imposed exile. "You look exactly like your mother at your age," he said, his voice breaking as he studied Maya's features through the pixelated connection, and Maya felt tears streaming down her face as she looked into the eyes of the man who had saved her life before she was old enough to remember his sacrifice. David's account of those final days on the mountain was devastating in its clinical precision, how Sarah had fought through 4 days of agony to bring Maya into the world, how she had held her daughter for precious minutes before internal bleeding claimed her life, how her last coherent words had been a desperate plea for David to keep Maya safe from a family she believed would crush her spirit, just as they had crushed her own. Victoria wept openly as she listened to her daughter's final moments, finally understanding that Sarah's rebellion had been motivated by love rather than selfishness, and that every choice she had made had been designed to protect the child she would never see grow up. Maya found herself staring at David's face, searching for traces of the father figure she had never known she had, while he described carrying a 3-day-old infant down a mountain in sub-zero temperatures that should have killed them both, using emergency equipment and sheer determination to deliver her to safety, despite odds that would have defeated a less motivated man. The story was simultaneously the most romantic and most tragic thing Maya had ever heard, a testament to love's power to transcend death while highlighting the devastating cost of family dysfunction that had prevented 3 generations from knowing each other. The revelation of Maya's true identity sent shockwaves through New York's social and business communities, with news outlets scrambling to verify the impossible story of the Blackwood heiress who had been serving their wine and clearing their tables for years without anyone recognizing the fortune she carried in her DNA. Maya watched in horrified fascination as reporters camped outside her modest apartment building and photographers tried to capture images of the girl whose life had transformed from invisible to front-page news in the span of a single afternoon, while Victoria's team of publicists worked around the clock to control a narrative that threatened to expose decades of family secrets to public scrutiny. The legal implications were staggering. Estate lawyers descended on the Blackwood offices like vultures, trying to determine how Maya's sudden appearance would affect inheritance plans, corporate succession, and financial structures that had been built on the assumption that Victoria's direct bloodline had ended with Sarah's death. Maya felt overwhelmed by the attention and the responsibilities that seemed to multiply hourly. Her simple dream of becoming a nurse suddenly overshadowed by expectations that she should take her place as a Blackwood heir despite having no training, experience, or desire for the corporate world that had consumed her newfound family. Victoria struggled with her own transformation from grieving mother to protective grandmother, her instinct to control warring with her desperate need to avoid repeating the mistakes that had cost her Sarah's love and ultimately her life. The mansion filled with advisors, accountants, and family friends who had known Sarah as a child and now studied Maya's face for resemblances that might help them process the miraculous resurrection of a bloodline they had mourned for 15 years. Maya found herself caught between 2 worlds, the comfortable anonymity of her old life and the suffocating expectations of her new identity, while trying to honor the memory of a mother she was only beginning to know, and a family legacy she had never wanted, but was now obligated to continue. The weight of her newfound identity crashed down on Maya like an avalanche as she stood in the marble foyer of the Blackwood mansion, surrounded by financial advisors, estate attorneys, and corporate executives who spoke in numbers so large they seemed abstract rather than real. Victoria had called an emergency board meeting to address what the media was calling the most shocking inheritance revelation of the decade, while Maya struggled to understand that her signature on a few documents would make her the controlling shareholder of a steel empire that employed over 50,000 people across 4 continents. The numbers were staggering. A trust fund worth $800 million that would be hers on her 25th birthday, stock options that could make her one of the youngest billionaires in history, and real estate holdings that included everything from Manhattan penthouses to private islands in the Caribbean. Maya felt nauseated as lawyers explained tax implications and investment strategies, while part of her mind kept returning to her abandoned apartment where unpaid bills were probably piling up on a kitchen table she had bought second-hand from Craigslist. The contrast was surreal and overwhelming. Just a week ago, she had been counting coins to buy instant noodles, and now men in $1,000 suits were asking her opinion about multinational corporate strategies she couldn't even pronounce. Victoria watched her granddaughter's mounting panic with growing concern, recognizing the same trapped expression that had haunted Sarah's face during similar family business meetings, and realizing that wealth could be as much a prison as poverty when it came with expectations you never asked to inherit. Maya's hands shook as she signed documents that transferred millions of dollars into accounts she hadn't known existed, while her mind reeled with the knowledge that she now had the power to change thousands of lives with decisions she felt completely unprepared to make. The public reaction to Maya's story transformed her from an anonymous nursing student into a reluctant celebrity overnight, with photographers stalking her every movement and reporters digging through her past with the thoroughness of archaeologists excavating ancient ruins. The restaurant where she had worked became a tourist attraction, with customers requesting to sit at tables she had once served, while her former co-workers gave interviews about the mysterious waitress who had turned out to be one of America's wealthiest heiresses. Maya watched in horror as her life became public property, every detail from her grades at nursing school to her dating history dissected by strangers who felt entitled to judge her worthiness for the fortune she had inherited through no choice of her own. Victoria's public relations team worked overtime to craft a narrative that would satisfy the media's hunger for scandal while protecting Maya's privacy, but the story was too sensational to contain. Social media exploded with theories about everything from conspiracy to divine intervention, while financial markets fluctuated based on speculation about how a 23-year-old with no business experience would handle a multi-billion-dollar corporation. The pressure was suffocating, with every public appearance analyzed for signs of how Maya was adjusting to wealth, or whether she was worthy of the Blackwood legacy, as if her DNA results were somehow subject to public approval. Maya found herself trapped between those who criticized her for being an undeserving heir and those who romanticized her Cinderella story, while she struggled to maintain some sense of her authentic self amid the chaos of her transformed circumstances. The girl who had once been invisible was now one of the most photographed faces in America, and the loss of anonymity felt like a death that no amount of money could resurrect. Victoria's own reckoning with her past behavior proved even more painful than Maya's adjustment to wealth, as she was forced to confront the devastating reality that her controlling nature had not only driven away her daughter, but had also robbed her of 15 precious years with a granddaughter who had grown up believing herself unwanted and alone. The therapy sessions that Marcus insisted she attend became a form of torture, where she relived every argument with Sarah, every attempt to dictate her daughter's choices, every moment when love had been twisted into control, until Sarah had preferred exile to submission. Dr. Patricia Wong, the family therapist Victoria hired, was relentless in her pursuit of truth, forcing the billionaire to examine how her own childhood, raised by parents who had valued the family business over emotional connection, had shaped her into someone who equated love with ownership and guidance with domination. Maya attended these sessions reluctantly, watching her grandmother decompose and rebuild her understanding of herself while trying to process her own anger at having been abandoned by people who should have protected her, but instead had been too damaged by their own dysfunction to recognize the harm they were causing. The revelation that Sarah had been driven to fake her death to escape her mother's influence was a wound that festered in Victoria's soul, made worse by the knowledge that Maya had spent her childhood in foster care, while Victoria had millions of dollars that could have provided her with every advantage. The billionaire's breakdown was complete and devastating. She had built an empire but destroyed a family, accumulated wealth but lost love, and succeeded in every way that could be measured except the ones that actually mattered. Maya found herself in the strange position of comforting the woman whose actions had indirectly caused her years of loneliness and uncertainty, while Victoria struggled to accept forgiveness from a granddaughter who had every reason to hate her, but seemed incapable of cruelty despite everything she had endured. The media frenzy reached its crescendo during Maya's first official appearance as a Blackwood heir, a carefully orchestrated press conference designed to address the questions that had been swirling around her story while establishing her as a legitimate member of one of America's most powerful families. Maya stood at the podium in a navy blue dress that cost more than her monthly rent had been, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands as she faced a room full of reporters who had been dissecting her life with the precision of surgical instruments. "I didn't choose to be born into this family," she began, her words carefully rehearsed but carrying genuine emotion that cut through the media cynicism like a blade. "I didn't choose to inherit wealth that I never earned, and I didn't choose to become a public figure whose every decision will be scrutinized by people who don't know me." The room fell silent as she continued, her composure growing stronger with each sentence. "But I did choose to honor the memory of a mother I never knew by using this inheritance to help children who are growing up the way I did, without families, without resources, and without hope that anyone cares whether they succeed or fail." Victoria watched from the sidelines, with tears streaming down her face as her granddaughter announced the establishment of the Sarah Blackwood Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting aged-out foster youth with college scholarships, job training programs, and the kind of emotional support that Maya had never received but was now in a position to provide to others. The announcement transformed Maya from a reluctant heiress into a purpose-driven philanthropist, while simultaneously giving meaning to Sarah's death and Victoria's fortune in ways that none of them could have anticipated. The press conference ended with Maya removing Sarah's emerald necklace and placing it around a photograph of her mother, a symbolic gesture that acknowledged the past, while promising a future where the Blackwood name would be associated with healing rather than control, generosity rather than greed, and love rather than the fear that had poisoned 3 generations of what should have been a blessed family. 2 years later, Maya stood in the lobby of the Sarah Blackwood Children's Center, watching as former foster youth received their college graduation certificates in a ceremony that would have been impossible without the foundation she had built from the ashes of her family's fractured legacy. The building itself was a testament to transformation. What had once been an abandoned warehouse in Queens had been converted into a state-of-the-art facility that provided everything from educational support to mental health services for kids aging out of the system, while the walls displayed artwork created by the young people who had found refuge within its doors. Maya wore simple scrubs instead of designer clothing, having returned to nursing school to complete her degree despite her newfound wealth, because she had discovered that her true calling lay in direct patient care rather than boardroom strategies or corporate empire building. Victoria sat in the front row of the ceremony, her transformation from ruthless businesswoman to devoted grandmother evident in every gesture as she applauded each graduate with tears streaming down her face, finally understanding that legacy was measured not in dollars accumulated, but in lives changed through genuine compassion. The emerald necklace rested in a place of honor in Sarah's memorial garden at the center, surrounded by flowers planted by children who would never know how much their own stories paralleled that of the young woman whose death had inadvertently created their salvation. Marcus had taken over day-to-day operations of Blackwood Industries, allowing Maya to pursue her passion for healing while maintaining her position on the board of directors, a compromise that honored family obligations without sacrificing personal authenticity. The balance was delicate but sustainable, proving that wealth could be a tool for good when wielded by someone who understood the true value of human connection over financial accumulation. The relationship between Maya and Victoria had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted, a bond forged through shared loss, but strengthened by mutual commitment to healing the wounds that had poisoned their family for generations. Their weekly dinners at the mansion had become sacred rituals, where Victoria shared stories about Sarah's childhood, while Maya described her experiences with the foster children whose lives she was helping to reshape through programs that addressed the systemic failures she had personally survived. Victoria's journey through therapy had been brutal but transformative, teaching her to express love through support rather than control, to offer guidance without demanding compliance, and to value Maya's independence as evidence of strength rather than rebellion. The billionaire had liquidated several major assets to fund the foundation's expansion, discovering that giving away money brought her more satisfaction than accumulating it ever had, while Maya learned to accept her grandmother's generosity without feeling obligated to surrender her autonomy in return. Their relationship was still fragile, built on a foundation of mutual forgiveness that required constant maintenance, but it was genuine in ways that Victoria's relationship with Sarah had never been allowed to become. Maya had insisted on keeping her modest apartment near the children's center, visiting the mansion for family obligations, but maintaining her own space where she could exist as Maya the nurse rather than Maya the heiress, a boundary that Victoria had learned to respect after years of therapy focused on understanding the difference between love and possession. The healing was imperfect and ongoing, marked by setbacks and breakthroughs that reminded both women that some wounds run so deep they never completely heal, but they can be transformed into sources of empathy that allow survivors to help others navigate similar trauma. David Chen had emerged from his self-imposed exile in Colorado to become an unexpected but vital part of Maya's extended family. His role as her biological father's best friend and her mother's true love, creating a connection that transcended traditional definitions of parentage. His first meeting with Maya at the Children's Center had been emotionally devastating for both of them. He saw Sarah in every gesture and expression, while she finally understood the source of her inexplicable love for mountains and wide-open spaces that had always felt like genetic memory calling her home. David's expertise in wilderness therapy had proven invaluable in developing programs for traumatized youth who responded better to outdoor challenges than traditional counseling, while his quiet presence in Maya's life provided the paternal stability she had never experienced but desperately needed as she navigated the complexities of her transformed circumstances. Victoria's acceptance of David had been perhaps the most surprising development of all, as she recognized that his love for Sarah had been pure in ways that her own maternal affection had been corrupted by expectations and control, and she found herself grateful to the man who had saved her granddaughter's life, even as he had honored her daughter's dying wish to keep Maya away from the family dysfunction that had destroyed Sarah's happiness. Their unconventional family unit, billionaire grandmother, mountain guide father figure, corporate lawyer uncle, and nursing student heiress, defied every social convention, but worked because it was built on mutual respect rather than blood obligation, shared purpose rather than inherited expectation. Maya often reflected on the cosmic irony that it had taken her mother's death to create the loving family that Sarah herself had never been allowed to experience. While David found peace in knowing that his years of exile and guilt had been transformed into something meaningful through Maya's commitment to helping other abandoned children find their own paths to healing and hope. The final scene unfolded in the memorial garden behind the Children's Center, where Maya had gathered with her unconventional family to mark the anniversary of Sarah's death, in a ceremony that celebrated life rather than mourning loss. Victoria knelt beside the memorial stone, her hands steady as she placed fresh mountain laurel, Sarah's favorite flower, around the base, while David shared stories about the woman they had both loved but lost to circumstances that seemed almost mythical in their tragic complexity. Maya read aloud from her mother's diary, passages she had discovered in Sarah's preserved room that revealed dreams of becoming a teacher, hopes of traveling the world, and most importantly, the fierce love she had felt for the child she would never see grow up but had died trying to protect. The emerald necklace caught the afternoon sunlight as it rested against the memorial stone, no longer a mystery or a burden, but a symbol of the unbreakable bonds that connect mothers and daughters across the veil of death, proving that love could survive even the most devastating circumstances and bloom into something beautiful when tended by hands that understood its true value. Marcus had brought his own children to the ceremony, Victoria's great-grandchildren, who would grow up knowing their family's history of both tragedy and redemption. While Maya's foster youth from the centre formed a circle around the memorial, living proof that broken families could be rebuilt through intentional love and unwavering commitment to healing. As the sun set over the garden, Maya realized that her journey from abandoned infant to reluctant heiress to purposeful healer had come full circle, not because she had found her biological family, but because she had learned to create chosen family through service to others who shared her experience of loss and transformation. The necklace would remain in the garden as a reminder that some treasures are meant to be shared rather than possessed, some legacies are built through giving rather than taking, and some families are forged through mutual commitment to healing the wounds that traditional kinship had been too damaged to mend. Maya's story had begun with a mother's desperate love and a father's impossible sacrifice, but it would continue through her own choice to transform inherited trauma into generational healing, proving that the most valuable inheritance wasn't money or property, but the wisdom to break cycles of pain and replace them with purposeful love.